Alright guys, Blake here again. So the purpose of this video is I'm going to do a little video on a little tank here. So we are going to deal with probably our most common tank we encounter on a routine basis at the hospital, and that is a medical oxygen E-cylinder, okay? They do come in other sizes. I shot the video for the big H tank. They do make other sizes for like home oxygen, but you'll see this for home oxygen. We use these for transport in the hospital and things like that. So it is important to recognize that our tank, and what I'm going to walk you through on how to place a regulator on this particular tank, is somewhat, I don't want to say it's a dying art, but it's something that current therapists or newer therapists aren't having to do near as much. We have what's called grab-and-go tanks at the hospital. So when we buy these from or rent these from the hospital and get refills, they come with a regulator permanently attached to this thing, so we don't have to do this step I'm going to walk you through here right now. It's funny, when things would come up, I'd get calls from other therapists about a patient on home oxygen or something going on with their tank and swapping it out, and it's like they never learned or just completely forgot it. So it is something that's very, very important because you never know what types of situations you're going to be tasked with either putting this on. I know sometimes we might have grab-and-go oxygen tanks, but if you're dealing with something where you have a 50 psi medical air need for transport, you might be using an E-cylinder. I've never seen a grab-and-go E-cylinder. So the concept, different pin position and things like that we'll talk about, but same general idea and steps and things like that. So the E-tank, still at a full pressure, it exerts the same amount of internal pressure, max fill, around 2200 psi or so in most instances. That does not mean that this tank and an H tank, just because they get the same pressure, has the same amount of gas. Okay, this one's a lot smaller, so it takes a lot less liters of gas in order to get a PSI accumulation, and that's where our tank factor comes in. 0.28 liters of gas to reach 1 PSI in this tank, where you got 3.14 in the big boy there. So keep that in mind when you're doing your tank duration calculations. There's only like 600 something liters of gas in this tank when it's completely full. So if you get some crazy number, you messed up on a decimal or something like that, okay? These tanks don't last that long, and that's why it's really, really important when we're doing a tank duration or cylinder duration calculation to make sure we got enough time to get from point A to point B. That gets a little bit more problematic when you're running a ventilator because there's a lot more variables there, but if you're sending somebody on transport for low flow, very, very important skill. I guarantee you to show up on your board exams. Let's talk a little bit more about tank markings. So for this particular tank, just like the H tank, our current vendor, what they do on these tank test dates is the most recent one, they will try and put a different color on there. So on this particular one, we have the yellow color, so don't go searching too far. You can see this tank was last tested in 11 or November of 2012. It has the plus on there, so that what that means is whatever the service pressure is stamped on this, all right, we could go 10% greater, and that's what gets us really to roughly 2200 psi for most tanks. Not all of them have pluses, but most of them have pluses. And then the star, meaning that this thing, instead of being only good for 5 years before it needs a retest prior to filling, we're good for 10 years. So our next tank test date would be, if this thing needed to be refilled after, November of 2022, so November of this year here, okay? And then you just got the tester's initials there. So that's a little bit about the tank markings. So these tanks are a little bit different. We don't have a cylinder cap like we do on an H tank. I call this the stem. You might hear, here, let me move this a little bit so it's not blending in with my tank holder. Technically, you can call it a yoke. It's a gas outlet, whatever you want to refer to it as. That part doesn't matter as much as knowing how to utilize this thing. So what this has is a separate safety system from the H tank, okay? And when I mean safety system, I'm primarily talking about how it hooks up. This thing has a fusible plug if it gets too hot and evacuates gas so it's not a bomb, whereas the H has that frangible disc. If pressure gets too high, I'm talking about the connection. So the H tank is the AS, or American Standard Safety System, deals with the threads and how that tank attaches. This tank uses a pin index safety system, so the PIS safety system, and the easiest way to remember that is little tank pisses me off, because you're going to have problems with the washer and the pins, and people generally struggle with this one a little bit more so than the H tank, although it's a little bit easier to run. So what does that exactly mean? So if you look right here, all this really is, and let me move a little bit closer to you here. So you can see this is actually the gas outlet. These two little holes are the pins we're referring to for this particular safety system. So what that means is regulators or any sort of pressure reducing setup that is meant to go on this tank and deal with oxygen is going to have a very specific set of pin locations. So if you look right here, I got two little pins. That corresponds with the pin position for an oxygen tank, okay? So this, if you look inside of there, I got these two pins, and then you can see there's a little brass piece That's the part that actually goes into this tank outlet, all right? And that's the thing that people get confused about. If you look on the posterior side of this cylinder head or the stem, you'll see there's a little dimple there, and then there's a little Torx screw bit, all right? And what that does is doesn't really do anything for us. I don't know if they utilize that when they're refilling these tanks or what, but you'll see people have this backwards, and everything goes all wrong, okay? So as long as you look at the tank and you realize, here's my pins, here's my gas outlet. This little dimple will come into play when I show you how to hook a regulator on here in just a moment. All right, you're never going to be wrong. So all the way this works really is there's a big screw or a big plug that goes down in here, and there's up top, when I use a proper key or a tool to spin this, it backs that screw out and it allows the high pressure gas to escape through there. So we need a way of turning this down from high pressure, 2200, down to generally standard working pressure, unless we're using like a board-on gauge or something like that. All right, so first order of business is to clear this tank of any debris, and you can see even though I got it up on a table, I got it in a little tank trolley so it's safe. You don't want to leave these things sitting upright. You would always, if you finish a transport and you got a tank, set it down on the ground so it can't fall. They're a little bit more vulnerable because of this piece and we don't have a cylinder cap. So tank key, you don't need to steal my tank keys. If you're at a place where you're dealing with H cylinders, they're going to have tank keys for you. Okay, so don't steal my tank key. All we really have is a piece of plastic or metal that's got some holes in it that correspond with this little valve up top here. All you're going to do, put this thing on there, and right now, just like with the H cylinders and everything else, we are going to go ahead and clear any debris. Now, if this tank was brand new, it comes with a plastic shroud over it that also includes a washer that I'm going to talk about here in a little bit. And maybe not as important. You just want to get in the habit of cracking the tank if you're ever doing any of this stuff with anything, just to be safe. We're trying to prevent any little particles that could accumulate in that gas outlet from making any sort of static discharge and potential problems as they're going through a system that we're hooking up. So I don't say cracking the cylinder. Once again, I say loud noise. Try and point it away from people. Keep my hands away. Turn that thing just counterclockwise or to the left if you're looking at it from above, and that clears any sort of debris. I'm going to go ahead and take my tank key off here. I'm going to show you a couple of different little regulators, and I'll show you a board-on gauge. So, like if we were dealing in a facility where you're still using these for transport or emergency room or something, I'd have one like this. It's still got the same pin positions. You can see we got our little pressure gauge, so we can read pressure and see how much gas is or how much pressure is in this tank and do a calculation. We got the pins. We'll talk about how to attach this thing here in a second. All we have over here, so once this goes into this regulator, what's happening is the pressure is reduced to standard working pressure, and it's 50 psi on this side, and then we have what's called an adjustable flow restrictor, pretty much a little valve that we're providing 50 psi to the backside, and as we turn this, it gives us a number or liter flow, and that's calibrated based upon 50 psi being continuous in the back, and that's how much flow would come out right here. With these more modern ones, you don't have a need for putting a Christmas tree adapter. It would hook up. This is only for oxygen therapy, so low flow oxygen or small bore oxygen tubing, not going to hook up 50 psi or anything like that. This particular one, I do have a couple of 50 psi auxiliary ports, so if I need to run pneumatic equipment or a ventilator or something like that, I got this quick access feature where I could throw it on a disconnection. It evacuate that 50 psi into my line and I'd be good to go, but I don't have to have anything hooked up on them. If I'm not using them, they close off. Don't put a Christmas tree on this, okay? It's not going to work, and you don't want 50 psi to go in your cannula. The patient's not going to like you very much. So we've cracked the cylinder. What these tanks require, because of its unique safety system, is a washer. That washer is going to go over this little brass piece. I'll go ahead and I'll go with the 50 psi one. We got another one here that doesn't have that 50 psi hookup, so you only got one spot there. I generally use these in your competencies a little bit more so you can tell me what these things are, okay? So there's a couple of different washer setups, and the washer is just going to go on this little brass piece right here and make a seal between this stem and the face of this regulator here, and making sure we're not losing gas, because then our tank duration calculation doesn't work. Most of the time, if you get a brand new tank, it's going to come with that little green wrap on there, and it's going to give you one of these little Teflon or nylon washers, okay? These are not really meant to be reused over and over again. What happens is every time you tighten them, it distorts the shape a little bit, so the next guy's got to tighten it a little bit more when they take it off, and then it gets to the point you can't seal the tank, and you're thinking it's user error, and it's not. It's a bad washer. So we always have these to use, okay? But if you have access to these, they're a little bit better. It's made out of metal and it's got a gasket material. These are really a little more user-friendly, and they're meant to be reused multiple times, and the shape does not distort. That gasket does eventually go bad, so it don't last forever, but they're much more frequent use. It's not going to mess them up. First thing you want to do, go ahead and put the washer on there. These ones fit pretty well, all right? I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to look at my pins, look at my pinholes, all right? You can see that's the gas outlet. That dimple on the backside right there, although I said it doesn't do anything necessarily for gas, as I turn this little corkscrew, it's going to be what puts pressure on that cylinder head and pulls everything tight so I get a good seal. You want that little tip to reside inside of that divot there. And if you have it inside of that divot, it means everything's lined up just perfect. So the first thing we're going to do, I try and take those pins as I slip this yoke fit, or is what I think they call these. I just say I'm slipping the regulator over this cylinder stem. You do want to make sure the corkscrew's nice and opened up. And I'm going to slide it into the pinholes, and I'm going to try and hold it nice and flush with this. I wish I was a little taller. All I'm going to do is tighten this to the right, and I'm watching that little tip go right inside of that divot, and I'm going to kind of hand tighten here, okay? So now that I've hand tightened, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to check my work, okay? These don't require anything too crazy. What I'm going to show you is how to open this tank. I want to point out one thing here. So if you look, this is open at 25 liters a minute. So when I open this, it's going to make a noise, and I'm going to think I wouldn't think I have a leak, but you might think you have a leak, all right? So not a bad habit to make sure you got that thing set at 0, and that's going to make you be able to detect if you got a leak a little bit quicker. So just like when we crack the cylinder to clear any debris, I'm going to open this thing up until I get pressure. So you can see my pressure gauge. Sorry, there's a little glare there. You can see my little pressure gauge, okay? Now, that means I had that thing just open enough for pressure to be exerted out of there, but just like with the H cylinders, you want to go ahead and open this thing up a little bit more. Ideally, you go all the way open, all right, and then do 3/4 or a full revolution in the opposite direction to make sure you don't get valve freeze. It kind of sucks with these particular tank keys because you keep hitting this, so you got to take it out. I do have this, but you won't always have it. It's one that you can simply slide on, and I can open this thing all the way up. And it takes a lot of screws there. All right, then I'm going to go ahead, turn that thing a full revolution. I'll be honest, if we're just running regular low-flow oxygen therapy or something, you're probably okay not going all the way, although that's what the book recommends. The problem is we're worried about the gas flow that's being pulled from it coming out quicker than the gas is, maybe going to be maintained on the backside, so you maybe not getting full 50 psi. And this number that we set here is based upon full 50 psi coming through. If you're running a ventilator, you definitely need to be sure that you're opening that up enough. Otherwise, you might not get your full 50 psi. So if you're worried about safety, go ahead, open the thing all the way up, turn it a full, 3/4 or a full turn. Back closed, and then you're good to go. So if I had a leak when I turned this thing on, no reason to panic, close it, ask yourself, did I remember to put a washer on there? That's the biggest mistake. If you forgot to put a washer on, you fix the problem. If you're thinking, hey, I got a washer, did you turn this thing back down where it's closed? All right, and then lastly, do you have this thing all messed up? I see people put these backwards every year and act like they've never seen the tank, all right, so I don't know what the deal is there, but if you just know how the tank works and you line everything up, this is pretty straightforward. It's not too hard at all. All right. So at this point, over here, I could hook up and run, just small bore oxygen tubing, cannula, Venimask, or anything like that. You want to be careful about some of the Venimask stuff and things that got a lot of resistance. The problem with like this, with anything that's flow restrictor or your board-on gauge or anything, and I'll show you a board-on gauge here in a second, is this number that I set up here to set liter flow. It's not guaranteed. It means if I got 50 psi and not a lot of obstructions, that's what I'm going to get. If I have a complete tubing occlusion, it still tells me 6, but nothing's coming out of there. I'm blocking all that pressure up. My patient's not going to be getting anything. So you got to be careful about your lines kinking and stuff like that. And that's what's nice. The flow meters are back pressure compensated, so you know exactly what you're getting. But we couldn't use that for transport. It's got to be upright all the time. So these are great for transport, but you got something with a lot of resistance, or if your lines get tangled up, you just got to keep tabs on your patient and make sure everything is good to go. We'll focus on the tank duration calculations and stuff, but if you look really close, these are generally pretty easy to read, although the numbers and lines are a little bit small, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in class. Once again, if I was going to run a ventilator or anything like that, I do have 250 psi auxiliary ports, so if I threaded on high pressure O2 tubing, or a hose, really more than just tubing, it would allow me to provide 50 psi to my device. Okay, so it'd be for vent transport and things like that. Obviously, a vent is going to run through this quite a bit quicker than if we were just doing regular oxygen therapy. We're going to focus on tank duration calculations or cylinder duration calculations and all that stuff a little bit more in class. Let's talk about taking this thing off here. So the first order of business is closing the tank. All right, that's where you might need to take this thing out of this tank trolley if you don't have this handy dandy little tank key like I got here that allows me to not bang my knuckles and the tool right on that. I still got pressure in this. Why is this? Well, because 50 psi and all that tank pressure was inside of this, and pressure is still trapped until we evacuate it. So on this point, you could either open this up, or you could hit the 50 psi tabs if you had them, and you can see that pressure dropping. If the pressure is not dropping, your tank is not closed, and you need to close your tank and then reconvene. You can also go ahead and bleed it out really quickly. You can see we're down to 0. All right, as far as our pressure goes, tank's closed. I don't hear any gas. Now, at this point, you could either be nice to the next person and turn this all the way back down to 0, or you can do what I do and sabotage the next person and leave it up at 25 so they freak out and think they have a leak. Totally your call. All right, so let's go ahead and dismantle this thing here now. So I got the tank key. I forgot to mention, I believe, that if you don't have the hand strength to tighten this, some people do use this as the tank key as a lever, so you can slide this on this little pin, and you can really wrench it down. All right, as you can see, some of my tank keys are a little bit distorted and bent because people use it all the time. As long as you got pretty strong hands, forearm strength, you should be fine. Sometimes breaking them free can be a little bit more challenging and everything like that. If it's giving you a lot of trouble breaking the thing free, ask yourself, did you release the pressure? Because if this thing's under pressure, it's going to be more difficult to remove all that. But you could use this as a wrench once again and break it the other way. I don't need that. I can just use my hands here. And you can see I don't have any hissing gas because I properly bled my system. And then I could go ahead and once again, if I didn't have this tank trolley and I just finished a transport, you want to set this tank down on its side as you're cleaning up all your business and stuff like that. Lay it down on the floor. You never want to leave them just sitting upright unattended. I hope that helps as far as the tanks go. We'll play with them a lot more in lab and everything. We'll talk about doing the duration calculations a little bit later on. Pretty straightforward, just basic little algebra and being able to read a tank. So I hope that helps, and more to come.